I had to pay almost full price for those darn things. Of course not.
Yours aren't discounted, which makes them more valuable.
Oh, there you go. Nick, are you next?
Yes, I am.
Am I eating into your time?
Yes, you are.
Well, then let me say, ha-ha on you. I'm going away, Nick, just as soon as I can get my computer picked up.
Okay. Okay, well, I guess I'll pretty much kick off straight away. We're keeping to a very strict timetable, I think. I'm going to speak for almost exactly an hour, just short, and then we will be handing over to Gary Hesseltine, I believe, at 9 p.m. For some of you who've got a hard copy of the schedule, there is no title for my talk. That's not because I'm an international man of mystery or because it's been classified. It is simply an administrative error, I think. The title is on the website, though, and it is UK Government Policy on UFOs. My background is that I'm Nick Pope. My background is that I worked for the British government for 21 years at the Ministry of Defence. And for 3 of those years, they move you around quite a lot on either level transfer or promotion. For 3 of those years, from 1991 to 1994, I ran the MOD's UFO project. And those of you that were here for the session this afternoon will have heard me give some testimony on that. I'm going to try not to repeat the whole thing, but I think there is a little bit of an overlap, and maybe some people here weren't there, and of course people have joined us. I think this is still being live streamed. So, I'm just going to give a brief canter through the history of the British government's UFO project, perhaps mention a couple of cases, and then we're going to get into a little bit of, perhaps interesting and more speculative material towards the end. The Ministry of Defence, which is basically the UK equivalent of the American DoD, first got drawn into the UFO phenomenon, in fact, during the Second World War, when pilots saw on bombing raids strange balls of light, and in some cases metallic discs, thought they were secret weapons of the Axis powers. After the war, it transpired that Axis pilots had seen the same thing and assumed that they were Allied weapons. These were dubbed Foo Fighters, and there are some very interesting reports in files at the National Archives in the UK. I think sometimes we're all familiar with having seen perhaps a couple of images of Foo Fighters looking like just little balls of light. In fact, if you go into some of the Bomber Command files where these reports are, you'll find that, in fact, there are some rather more substantial craft that were witnessed in terms of dimensions and the fact that these were solid and not just balls of light. After the Second World War, particularly in Scandinavian countries, there were sightings of what were dubbed ghost rockets. And again, all these names, Foo Fighters and ghost rockets, are really precursors for what were dubbed flying saucers and eventually UFOs. MOD really got stuck into this, apart from these ad hoc issues, in 1950, when the chief scientific advisor, the great radar scientist and pioneer Sir Henry Tizard, he'd been brought back into government by Winston Churchill, and he'd been basically the chief scientific advisor. Sir Henry Tizard said, in relation to media reports of these flying saucers, as they were dubbed at the time, we ought not to be dismissing these reports without first conducting some sort of proper scientific investigation. And the British did what the British do so well. They set up a committee to discuss this, and this Ministry of Defence committee, to my mind, is, I believe, one of the most marvellously named committees in the history of the British government anywhere, the Flying Saucer Working Party. And the Flying Saucer Working Party looked into the mystery, got alongside colleagues in the United States who were already, of course, investigating this issue. You had Project Sign, Project Grudge, and Project Blue Book. The Flying Saucer Working Party reported in June of 1951, issued a very skeptical 6-page report, and it basically said that all these flying saucer sightings could be explained as misidentifications, hoaxes, or delusions. And the recommendation was that no further resources should be put into this mystery. The matter would probably have rested there, was it not for the fact that very shortly after those skeptical conclusions, there was a wave of incredibly interesting sightings over the United Kingdom in 1952, involving lots of reports from pilots, from other military personnel, sightings in particular during the big NATO exercise, Main Brace. And it transpired that UFOs were being seen not just by some of the air crews involved in Operation Main Brace, but from some of the ships too. This was, I believe, Main Brace was the largest exercise conducted by this new alliance, NATO, the largest gathering of military forces since the end of the Second World War. And there was a heck of a lot of UFO activity during it. Was it Soviet and Warsaw Pact keeping track of what NATO was up to, or was it something else? We don't know. But the fact of the matter remains that there were these UFO sightings, and the Ministry of Defense was dragged somewhat reluctantly back into the issue that it had tried to extract itself from just a few months earlier with the Flying Saucer Working Party's skeptical conclusions and recommendations. And pretty much since 1953 through to 2009, when it fell victim to defense cuts, the Ministry of Defense had in one way, shape or form a UFO project. Unlike America, Sign, Grudge, Blue Book, we never gave ours a formal name. So it was simply embedded in a wide range of different divisions, something of an alphabet soup, I'm afraid. S4, S6, DS8, SEC-AS, DAS, and over the years people have said, my goodness, there's a vast range of departments involved in the study of UFOs in Britain. Well, no, it's effectively just bureaucracies doing what bureaucracies do, changing titles, passing responsibility from one area to another. Sometimes, indeed, this research effort had an Air Force lead. Sometimes it had a civilian Ministry of Defense lead, and I was a civilian. By the time I took over this job in 1991, it was completely civilian. We had, of course, our military experts that we would defer to on radar investigations, imagery analysts when we got into looking at photos and videos, all the sorts of specialist staffs you would expect to see involved in a UFO research program. In terms of both the terms of reference, the investigative methodology, and the conclusions, the Ministry of Defence's UFO program might almost be called Son of Blue Book. I mean, we really did liaise very closely with the Americans in those early years, even down to the design of the forms on which UFO sightings would be submitted. And really, if you look at all of this, you can see great parallels between the British and the American system. The basic terms of reference were to research and investigate the UFO phenomenon, to look at all sightings reported to the department, to see whether anything brought to our attention suggested evidence of a potential threat to the defense of the United Kingdom or anything of more general defense interest. A term which, interestingly, we hardly ever attempted to define. We, in terms of, as I say, the investigative methodology, interview the witness, check the radar tapes, check things like the notices to airmen to see if you can correlate the sightings that you get with some conventional object or phenomena. And indeed our conclusions at the end of our investigations were pretty much the same sort of thing as you can read in Project Blue Book. Statistics have varied over the years, but I think it is a reasonable estimate to say something like 80% explained in conventional terms with high degree of certainty, aircraft lights, weather balloons, meteors, satellites, etc. 15% insufficient data to make a firm conclusion, 5% unknown. And of course that's where people get excited. They say, wow, aliens. Well, of course that's not what we said at all. Unknown means unknown. And while we didn't rule out the extraterrestrial hypothesis, while we didn't really rule out any hypothesis, I come back to that point. It's very important to say unknown simply means unknown. And whilst various people at either end of the belief spectrum in the subject have attempted to spin that conclusion, it really just does mean we don't know. And that, incidentally, is not a comfortable place for the Air Force and the government to be. And that kind of embarrassment factor, that there might be things in our airspace that we don't know about, I think is one of the things that leads to this policy of downplaying the subject and really not talking about it that much. And that, in many people's minds, gets perhaps misinterpreted as the sinister cover-up and conspiracy that many people believe operates. And I'll address that in a moment. But I want to, this is, and apologies, I don't have it scanned in or anything, but I sometimes think documents are a little hard to read. But this is a very important document. It is called Unidentified Aerial Phenomena in the UK Air Defence Region. And colloquially, this was known as Project Condign. This was a Defence Intelligence Staff study into the UFO phenomenon, not reinvestigating individual cases, but trying to take a more holistic look at some of the data that we'd amassed over the years, trying to do some trend analysis, trying to go out into the scientific community, looking at some of the papers that have been published, not just in the UK, but in the US, in the Soviet Union, and elsewhere. An attempted to say, what do we really know? What have we amassed about the UFO mystery over the years? And what else is there out there that might help us find a way through this? And I think, again, with the fact that this talk is called British Government Policy on UFO, it's just worth my reading a couple of bits and pieces from this. And again, what I think is interesting about this document, and this is just the executive summary, by the way, the report itself comes to 468 pages, which is why I didn't burden the committee today with the whole thing. But I will send them a hyperlink if they want. So, a really good summary, I think, of what MOD knows about UFOs. And you can interpret this if you're a believer in a very positive way, and perhaps if you're a skeptic in another way. But I want to just read this quote. And by the way, we use the phrase UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, as opposed to UFO, because of the kind of negative pop culture baggage that the term UFO has, where it's become synonymous with alien spacecraft. And my goodness, how many times do you hear people say, do you believe in UFOs? Well, it's a nonsense question. You can't not believe in UFOs. People see things in the sky that they can't identify. What the questioners really mean is, do you think that some UFOs might be extraterrestrial in origin, if that's your thing? This is the quote. That UAP exist is indisputable. Credited with the ability to hover, land, take off, accelerate to exceptional velocities and vanish, They can reportedly alter their direction of flight suddenly and clearly can exhibit aerodynamic characteristics well beyond those of any known aircraft or missile, either manned or unmanned. That's what MOD, Defence Intelligence staff, have to say about this. And by the way, the original classification when this was done, secret UK eyes only. So really, with all the caveats, bear in mind secret is just one down from top secret. So that, I think, is quite a bullish statement on that for a government department which traditionally, if the media asks about this, says, oh, we're not really interested and there's nothing to it. Again, I'll come on to spin, perhaps, in a moment. Air safety implications. A very important aspect of all this, something that underpinned a lot of the reasons why we were interested in this, was the fact that while we did take reports from everyone, and indeed by volume, most of the sightings do come from the public, just as by volume, most of the UFO material we have is unclassified. A small but rather more interesting proportion like this was given a rather higher stamp. But commercial airline pilots and military personnel consistently encounter UFOs. A disappointingly small proportion of them report it, either because, rightly or wrongly, they fear there will be adverse career consequences. One military pilot once told me, I didn't want to be known as Flying Saucer Fred in the officers' mess, so I stayed quiet. Many commercial airlines said, and I've heard this from several pilots, including senior captains, you know, yes, I had a sighting, but no, the airline said it would not be good for business, and therefore it would not be good for my job prospects in the longer term. Hint, hint. So, but we do have some reports on record. We've heard some of them, I think, this week. We have another panel, I believe, on the air safety implications, which I'm not sitting on, but we have a lot of experts who are well worth listening to. Let me read to you what Project Condign says about air safety. And again, excuse me, struggling through the executive summary here. Okay, here's an interesting quote, and just bear in mind, this was a redacted version of this was declassified and released in May 2006. But sometimes, you know the old phrase, the best place to hide a book is in a library. When this was released, few press actually bothered to go through all 468 pages. And sometimes, shall we say, the MOD press office didn't exactly go overboard to point out the most explosive bits here. In fact, quite the contrary. There was a little cover note really saying, oh yes, we did a study, but you know, we didn't really find anything of any interest. Well, hold on. Here we are, page 10 of the executive summary. Attempts by other nations to intercept the unexplained objects, which can clearly change position faster than an aircraft, have reportedly already caused fatalities. Excuse me? And would you believe, few if any media people even saw that. And as I say, MOD press office drew the attention to deliberately, perhaps, rather more mundane parts of the reports and said, yeah, we weren't really interested in that. But that's a fairly interesting little soundbite. Fatalities, wait a minute. Recommendations. Oh, here's the one that they focused on. The press office drew everyone's attention to this. It should no longer be a requirement for DI-55, that's part of the Defence Intelligence staff, to monitor UAP reports, as they do not demonstrably provide information useful to defence intelligence. So it looked like the key recommendation was, we're not interested, there's nothing to this. But if you had just read a little further, subsidiary recommendations on the air safety issue again. No attempt should be made to outmaneuver a UAP during interception. Okay. And another one. At higher altitudes, although UAP appear to be benign to civil air traffic, pilots should be advised not to maneuver other than to place the object astern if possible. Translation, don't mess with them. Now, one of the controversial conclusions of Project Condign, and by the way, unlike some UFO documents that you'll hear, there is zero dispute about the authenticity of this. You can get it off the MOD's website, or the website of the UK National Archive. So, very important point to make in a field such as UFO study, where sometimes there is a debate to be had about the provenance and authenticity of things. But just again, for those people when this story came out who thought that this is all just a bit of a non-issue, a couple of other interesting little quotes here. Bottom of page 9 of the executive summary. As I say, one of the controversial conclusions was that some UFO reports might be attributable to some sort of exotic atmospheric plasmas which could change shape, which could sometimes show up on radar, sometimes not. I am not going to get technical with you, not least because I'm not a scientist, and parts of this report are extremely technical. But from the executive summary we read, there is evidence from openly published scientific papers that scientists in the former Soviet Union have taken a particular interest in UFO phenomena. They have identified the close connection with plasma technologies and are pursuing related techniques for potential military purposes. For example, very high power energy generation, RF weapons, impulse radars, air vehicle drag and radar signature reduction or control, and possibly for radar reflecting decoys. The sort of translate that into English version is whatever the UFO phenomenon turns out to be, there are people who are looking at novel military applications, including weaponization of it. So, again, I think the media missed that one too. And just in case anyone thought that MOD was not interested in this, on that point it says right at the end, it is recommended that further investigation should be made into the applicability of various characteristics of plasmas in, and this lovely phrase again, novel military applications. I believe it was the senator who asked me today about directed energy weapons and whether any of this ties in. Well, yes, it does. With respect to the possibility of the use of plasmas for military applications, it is noted that the implications have already been briefed to the relevant MOD technology managers. So, this is Defence Intelligence Staff material, which at the time, it was never envisaged would be made public. And it was only through a combination of Freedom of Information Act requests and really the department being painted into a bit of a corner on this, that this saw the light of day. And I do want to address the issue of downplaying the subject. I've hinted at it, I've given a couple of examples. Let me contextualize that. As I mentioned, no Air Force, no government can be comfortable with a situation where there are unidentified objects in our airspace being tracked on radar, performing speeds and maneuvers that we can't match, being seen by commercial airline pilots and military pilots, and sometimes coming terrifyingly close to actually having a collision. And many of you will have seen, I think, on the front page of the BBC News website 2 days ago, so not some obscure website, the UK AirProx board, AirProx is air proximity, looked at yet another case where there was a near miss between a UFO and commercial aircraft. We have many such cases. This is not a comfortable area for government to address. This is not a situation with which we were happy. And there was, I think you could say, a consistent, over the years, policy to do two things. Firstly, to downplay the extent to which we were interested in this at all. I mean, Project Condign is the perfect illustration of that. If any reporter, you know, mainstream journalist, BBC, you know, ABC, NBC, CNN, it could be from anywhere in the world, New York Times, Washington Post, phoned up the MOD press office and said, "What's your line on UFOs?" The line would essentially be boiled down to a single soundbite. UFOs, we look at them to see if there are any defense implications, any potential threat, but we have concluded that the phenomenon is of no defense significance. And it's that no defense significance. Sometimes we use no defense interest, but that's the key soundbite. If you want MOD's public line in 3 words, that's it, no defense significance. However, you know, how does that sit with what I've just read out to you? That all the time we were telling people, we're not really interested in this, we just have a casual look, it's, you know, we don't really pay much attention, and none of these reports turn out to be interesting. And yet, behind the scenes, documents like this are being produced and given classifications just down from top secret. And people are talking about fatalities where these things have been chased by pilots trying to intercept them. People talk about novel military applications and MOD technology managers being briefed on these novel military applications, directed energy weapons, etc. Does this look to you, does that sound to you like no defense interest? Because it doesn't sound like that to me. So we had an almost, and I've heard this word, I was going to use it, someone beat me to it. It is almost Orwellian. It is a piece of 1984 doublethink that, on the one hand, we were pushing this line, no defence significance, aggressively to the UK Parliament, to the media, to the public, and yet behind the scenes, this is the sort of thing that was going on. These are the sorts of conclusions that people were reaching. And does that mean that the department lied? I'm very careful with phrases like that, words and phrases like that. I think there is a case to be made that if they didn't lie, they were somewhat economical with the truth, to borrow a phrase. You may remember that one from the Spycatcher trial, but that's a whole nother story. Oh, by the way, this is slightly off topic, but I think it gives you a sense of how the MOD perhaps spins an issue and downplays an issue. But a few years ago, the same sorts of areas of the Ministry of Defence as were involved in this study looked at the issue of so-called remote viewing. This is a very technical sounding term for seeing whether psychics might be able to locate items of interest to defence. Now, we didn't do this because we corporately believed in ESP, but we did it because it was what you might consider a low probability, high impact situation. Look, chances are it won't work. But if it does, the payoff is so huge that it's worth putting a little bit of money and effort into this. And I don't have it with me, but again, You can go to the Ministry of Defence website, you can key in, I think, the term remote viewing, and you'll be able to turn up a study into this. The study wasn't done very well for a number of reasons which are really outside the scope of this talk. What is, I think, relevant to this talk, because it's another good example of spin and downplaying something which is something exotic that Ministry of Defence has looked at, but doesn't really want to be caught looking at in quite this depth. When you read, when they had to put this out because of a Freedom of Information Act request, they slipped it out onto the website on the same day, and it went out under the heading remote viewing. And with apologies, because I hadn't planned to unpack this particular anecdote until a few minutes ago. So I don't remember the exact quote, but I think it's a pretty fair paraphrase. And it starts off by saying, some years ago, we became interested in the idea of what people might be able to see. And we decided to look at this issue. Nowhere on the front page where this thing was posted did you see the word psychic. Nowhere did you see the word clairvoyant. Nowhere did you see the phrase ESP. And part of that was to spin this as something completely different and hope that no one would notice. Comes back to the point, best place to hide a book is in a library, best place to hide a tree is in a forest. But the other reason, of course, is that I suspect, though I don't know, that it was thought that this would be another useful tactic for ensuring that this didn't come up particularly high on the rankings when people started searching using keywords like remote viewing. So again, it's an interesting example, I think, of how governments can play down their involvement and their interest in these sorts of exotic areas that governments can and do look at. Not because they necessarily believe it's all true, but because they are interested in the potential payoffs if it does turn out to work. And it's no secret now, and many of the records have been declassified, that certainly the US government did have a number of remote viewing programs and did see if they could be used to locate things like hostages in Beirut, the locations of Soviet ballistic missile submarines on patrol, terrorist training camps, drug shipments, etc., etc. That's all pretty much a matter of public record now. So I think that gives you an insight into how MOD looked at the UFO issue, and remote viewing too, but really pushed a very watered down version of this when Parliament asked. And Parliament is to the UK, I guess, what Congress is here. I mean, if parliamentarians are looking and asking about this issue, or any issue, you drop everything and you have to give them an answer. And if you lie to them or if you mislead them, even inadvertently, there will be consequences. So this is no small thing when Parliament starts to take an interest in UFOs, but as I say, consistently over the years, this no defence significance soundbite was trotted out again and again. I want to perhaps move the discussion just slightly off Ministry of Defence for a moment, but it's directly relevant to what we're talking about here this week. And we haven't really gotten into wider issues, I think, of who else is looking at this. And we've had a couple of questions. People have said, well, what does the mainstream scientific community think about this? What does academia think about all this? And I think it's fair to say that, generally speaking, the scientific community is extremely skeptical about UFOs. But I do just want to touch on two discussion meetings that took place in 2010 that I attended, which which I think might offer an interesting insight into how some of these issues can be taken forward and how this question can perhaps be broken out and looked at in a wider way. The Royal Society is one of the most prestigious scientific organizations on the face of the planet. And it celebrated, we Brits love things like this, it celebrated its 300th anniversary, I think, a few years ago. We do things like that. Previous fellows of the Royal Society include Sir Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, more recently people like Stephen Hawking. This is a pretty heavy group of men and women, and one or two fairly bright people there. And they held 2 discussion meetings in 2010. The first was called The Detection of Extraterrestrial Life and the Consequences for Science and Society. And the second one, which was really a follow-up, building on some of those themes, was Towards a Societal Agenda on Extraterrestrial Life. Now, this is the sort of thing I'm sure that many people here today would have loved to have attended and heard about and been involved in. And you know, there was nothing secret about this. The proceedings were published on the web. The meetings were open. I just walked in. I think I had to pick up an invite, but it wasn't hard. And what was interesting about this, and I realize that I'm breaking away somewhat from UK government policy on this, but I hope that you'll find it interesting. What this was a multidisciplinary group of scientists coming together and discussing not UFOs. I mean, this was astrobiology rather than ufology, but essentially discussing how is the search for alien life going, and much more interestingly, what's going to happen if and when we find it. Now, some people were looking, this is a whole bunch of people looking for very different things in different ways with different methodologies. Some people were looking for microbial life within our own solar system. Some people think we're getting very close to that sort of thing. Microbes on Mars, or Europa perhaps. Other people, astronomers using radio telescopes, are listening for signals from other civilizations, thinking that that might be a very good way to detect civilizations if they are out there. I know a whole bunch of people in the UFO community aren't comfortable with that. I think it's worth doing. Why wouldn't it be? And at the high end of the spectrum, some people were prepared to ask some of the questions that were asked here. Probably more over the coffee and biscuits than in the formal sessions, I have to say. But people were prepared to say, what if one day we do have some sort of scenario where we do make direct contact? And what was, I think, interesting and important about these meetings was the fact that they were so multidisciplinary. You had chemists, biologists, physicists, astrophysicists, cosmologists, but also anthropologists, theologians, psychologists. And the meetings did address some of the really interesting questions that I think fall out of this issue, but perhaps don't get discussed. Sometimes we get a little bit too hung up, I think, on does it exist or doesn't it? Is there a cover-up or isn't there? What is the UFO phenomenon? But I think some of these follow-up questions take us to a more interesting place. And people were asking questions like, what would be the effect on people's religious worldviews? What would be the effect on people's personal paradigms and maybe our societal worldview? And an awful lot of cliches were challenged, I think. You hear a lot of people say, oh, there'll be panic in the streets, the international banking system will collapse, people's religious faith will be shattered. Actually, a lot of those things turn out not to be true. And Ted Peters, a theologian, has gone and done some work, for example, on religion, has found that, if anything, confirmation of the discovery of extraterrestrial life, whether that's microbial or whether it's other civilizations, would slightly strengthen people's religious beliefs, not shatter them. Reason? I guess it just makes the universe look even more bigger and wonderful. So, you know, sometimes you have to ask these questions in a scientific way and get beyond the cliches to get to some of the more interesting aspects, I think, of this intriguing mystery. And I read into the public record in my testimony a document which I think always gets a laugh. It's one of the most extraordinary defense intelligence staff documents. And I'm just going to bring the discussion briefly back to the Ministry of Defence from the Royal Society. This is from a 1995 Defence Intelligence Staff document which speculated, you know, what might this be? And after a lot of toing and froing about what we might be dealing with, obviously the author thought, well, you know what, I'm just going to come out and say it. And at the end it says, if the sightings are of devices not of this earth, then their purpose needs to be established as a matter of priority. There has been no apparent hostile intent, and other possibilities are: 1, military reconnaissance; 2, scientific; 3, tourism. Everyone, this is a government document, Defence Intelligence Staff. It goes on to say, and again, it goes on to say and to echo a point that I've touched on in relation to Project Condign. We could use this technology if it exists. Well, of course. Yeah, absolutely. But people, I think, laugh about that line, tourism, and say, are these people serious? Are these really government intelligence experts writing this sort of thing? Yes, they are. And actually, it's an interesting point, and it's a point that came up at the Royal Society. Think about it this way. If we are ever visited by another civilization, self-evidently, if they can get here, viable interstellar travel calls for a technology orders of magnitude above anything we've got in our fairly basic space program that has just about gotten a handful of probes somewhere about the border of the edge of the solar system, but not even a sizable fraction of a percentage to even the nearest star. Orders of magnitude above anything we have. Is it likely that we will have anything to teach such a civilization about physics, about engineering? No, I would put it to you that it's not. So that being the case, it does seem more logical that the things that would make us interesting would be art, literature, architecture, and the good old sites like the Grand Canyon and maybe even the White House. So tourism is not as funny or as bizarre and perverse as I think some people first think when they read that document. It was actually a serious and I think quite well-made point. Now, dipping back to the Royal Society, I like doing this. One of the suggestions that was made was, and this was by a former NASA chief historian, Stephen Dick, I believe. One of the suggestions made was that we might be living in a largely, quote, post-biological universe, unquote. Raises some very interesting issues about consciousness, artificial intelligence, but I can tell you, I sat through these sessions at the Royal Society, and when I heard people like that using the phrase, and this one really stuck in my mind, immortal thinking machines, I had to remind myself that I was not at a sci-fi convention. I was sat at the Royal Society, and I was listening to people speculating about what we might one day encounter. And I think those two meetings were extraordinary. One other aspect of this, and it came up in today's session when the chair raised at the end the question of international cooperation on this issue and whether perhaps the United Nations might have a role in all this. One of the people who went to the second Royal Society discussion meeting, and I listened to her presentation and I had the chance to speak to her about this issue one-on-one, was Dr. Mazlan Othman. Dr. Othman is a Malaysian astrophysicist. She heads up the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, wonderful title. The UN Office for Outer Space Affairs is the office which services the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. They do issues such as debris from defunct satellites, who owns the moon, whether we should have quiet parts of the moon where probes don't land so that we can do some astronomy, some radio astronomy one day on the dark side of the moon, those sorts of issues. So the question was asked, and it's an interesting one, going back to this concept of radio astronomy. And what if we picked up a signal, which the scientific community, of course, regard as far more likely than the archetypal landing on the White House lawn? And I suspect they're probably right, though I will just quote the late, great counterculture philosopher Terence McKenna, who said in relation to this, that to search the galaxy expectantly for a radio signal was as culture-bound an idea as searching it for a good Italian restaurant. But that being the case, I do think it is arguably rather more likely that we'll pick up a signal than we'll have someone land on the White House lawn, though, of course, I can't rule it out. The question then arises, and this, my goodness, things got heated at the Royal Society over this one. If we pick up a signal, 3 questions. Do we reply? If we reply, who replies? And what do we say? And things got pretty heated over that, as you can imagine. Some people thought that there should be a moratorium on replying before, a moratorium in which a body like the United Nations should perhaps take the lead in making the decision. Others argued against that and said, look, it's too late. If you're concerned with all this, and it's the Stephen Hawking quote that many of you will have heard, I'm sure. He said, if we encounter an extraterrestrial civilization, it would be somewhat akin to the Europeans encountering the Native Americans. Only this time, he said, we're the Native Americans. So Stephen Hawking and others said, and this is a quote, I think, from another scientist, Simon Conway, I believe, if the cosmic phone rings, don't answer. But other people, particularly, of course, the radio astronomers who are doing this, say, nonsense. It's anti-science, and it's far too late anyway, because through our radio transmissions, we've been a detectable civilization for decades. So the response from the radio astronomers was, any civilization that has the capability to threaten us is already aware of us. So, it's too late. It's a done deal. SETI, which is they had some NASA funding some years back. Now it's all privately funded. Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. They ran a project called Earth Speaks. And one of the questions that they asked, and this was the one asked at the Royal Society, of course, was, well, what would you say? And it was a bit of fun. They basically said, please design your message to an extraterrestrial civilization. And they got, as you can imagine, a wide range of stuff, some clever things. Someone wrote, interestingly enough, in binary code. And someone wrote, I believe, I'm quoting this pretty much accurately, do not bother coming here, it is really boring and we are deadly, or something like that. So, in one of the sessions, it was suggested by one of the panelists that a series of sages, sages, wise people might perhaps pontificate about this question. Who should we reply? Who should reply, and what should we say? And in the Q&A session, a scientist said furiously from the floor, do you think the other 7 billion of us might get a say in any of this? So I think there are some big questions to be asked. One of the other fascinating questions and issues that came up at the first Royal Society discussion meeting was the search for the shadow biosphere. This is a very interesting question, I think, which a lot of people in the UFO community don't really follow, but it's quite interesting, and it's directly relevant to the question of whether there is or isn't alien life. And here's the thing. You'll often hear people say, in relation to life on Earth, life arose almost as soon as it really could, given the cessation of planetary bombardment in the very early part of the history of planet Earth. And people are fond of saying, oh, life arose quickly and easily, even though no one is entirely clear how it arose. And that's not even getting into the whole science versus religion debate. But here's the problem with that, for those people who like to say that should be proof that the cosmos is full of life. The problem is if life did develop quickly and easily on planet Earth, why only once, apparently? Why does all life seem to be traceable back to what science calls the UCA, the Universal Common Ancestor? If life is so quick and easy, why isn't it cropping up spontaneously now? Why hasn't it arisen twice, 3 times, multiple times? And that's a big question. And I don't have time to go into it, but suffice to say, people like Felissa Wolfe-Simon, in her work at Mono Lake in California, is looking, I think, for things that might turn out to be the shadow biosphere, though there is no evidence of that just yet. Certainly she published a paper which suggested a year or so ago that microbes had been found with arsenic instead of phosphorus, and that therefore this fundamentally, this different building block of life fundamentally changed our definition of life, or it should. And that's why, interestingly, NASA, when she announced her findings, published, she did so in a press conference that was actually put on by NASA as a joint thing, because NASA said quite rightly, if this turns out to be true, if this did turn out to be the shadow biosphere, if you can accept that life arose twice, not once, then yes, I think everyone would accept that the universe is probably teeming with life, because that really would suggest that it's quick and easy. But Felissa Wolfe-Simon's results have been challenged, and that whole debate is still going on. But it's worth following, I think, this quest for the shadow biosphere. And I think I am running perilously close to eating into Gary Hesseltine's time here. I know that he'll be looking to start at 9 o'clock. So I think I'm going to wrap it up. And thank you very much indeed for listening.